This is the first recording on the chapter of sex and gender. There are three main points that I want to emphasize in this chapter. First is that sex and gender are not the same thing. Our culture uses these concepts interchanged, but they are not the same thing. The second is that gender is social, and gender is a socially constructed phenomena that we have created this idea that that boys and girls are different from one another. And then the third is that there are real consequences for gender. There are consequences for the way we've defined womanhood or feminine, and there are consequences for the way we've defined masculine. So if you're following along in your chapter outline, the first box talks about or asks the question, how many sexes are there? So the first thing we have to do is define what we mean by sex and gender. And sometimes it's easier to begin that conversation with how many sexes are there? And most people will say two. Well, then the question becomes, are we defining sex based on primary sexual characteristics or secondary sexual characteristics? Sex is biological. We define sex as our external physical genitalia, which is our secondary sexual characteristics, and our internal biological structures, and that is your primary. So you have uterus for female, and you have testes for male. But we also can define sex from the way our body changes is in response to our genes. If we just look at chromosomes, if we just look at X and Y, we can identify at least 5 variations in human. You have XX, which is female, which have uterus. We have XY, which have testes. Then you have a phenomenon called Turner syndrome, which is XO. We have a triple X, where you have 3 X's. There's also XXY, and in some cases there's XYY. Now, if we were in an anatomy book, these might be described as disordered or different, but the point is that nature creates at least 5 different genetic variations. And then from these genetic variations, it causes our bodies, internal and external, to change. So it really challenges the notion that there are only 2 sexes. Furthermore, what culture has done is culture has tied the way we're supposed to act, or assumes that our actions are influenced by our biology. And again, this is a sociology class, so I'm going to focus or emphasize, I want to make sure we focus on the learning, right? The idea that the way that we interact in the world is based on social forces. If we were in a psychology class, I would be emphasizing the biology. So in sociology, we argue that the way our body is has nothing to do with the way we interact with the world. That's what gender is. Gender is the way that we think about ourselves. It's the way that we dress. It's the way we wear our hair. It's the jobs that we take. It's, do we prefer to cook or do we prefer to do yard work? But what our culture has done is it's taken these ways of being, these ways of interaction, the ways of acting, and it said, if you have a certain biology, if you have a vagina or a penis, then you cook. If you have a penis, you work outside, right? And that's the so what? That's the social construction piece, right? And that's what sociologists emphasize, or we draw most of our attention to this phenomena that our bodies have very little to do with how it is true. It is true that male bodies have more muscle mass, so they're stronger, right? In the legs, women, I forget how that is. One way, men have it in their upper body. That's right. Women have it in their lower body. It is true that women have more oxytocin, and oxytocin is a hormone which psychologists refer to as the trust or the bonding hormone. So there certainly are some physiological predictors of behavior, but the sociologists argue we have overemphasized those physiological, the role of the physiological with the social. And furthermore, this is the big so what, is those ways of being that are associated with uteruses have less social worth or less social value, or they are what sociologists call, we devalued the feminine, and we've given more power and more status to the masculine, to the ways that are associated with male. And I'll talk more about that in another lecture. But I'd like to draw your attention now to the next box, and that is defining gender. And then so I would ask you a question then about how many genders are there? Well, if there's at least 5 sexes, how many genders are there? Our culture likes to tell us that there are 2, right? That there are male and female. Now, things are changing very rapidly in our understanding of gender. But for the most part, our language limits us to, you have male and you have female. And if you don't identify as male or female, what do we call you? Now, I have some associates, some friends who identify as neither male nor female, and they use the pronoun they or them, right? So we have he, she, and then them somewhere in the middle. So I think a better way, and sociologists often use this notion, a better way to think about both sex and gender is we think about them as they're running along a continuum, right? So imagine a room, and we had a room full of naked women, right? And we lined the women up, and we had the most feminine, the most curvy woman on one end and the least curvy woman on the other. It'd be this huge continuum of very human variations amongst people that identify as women. We could do that with a room full of men too, and we have this huge variation. You'd have very masculine, bodies and less masculine bodies. But we can think about how do we consider ourselves, I don't like this word, right, girly girls or man's man, right? And you can have very feminine kind of women who do all of the feminine dress and the feminine activities and all of that. And then you can have less feminine women, and the same thing with men. So a better way to think about both sex and gender is we think about them along a continuum. Right? Now, the so what, and this is on the next slide here, this so what, the sociological significance, a really important phrase, the sociological significance. Why does it matter that we have boys and girls? I want to make sure that I'm very clear. I am not, and sociologists do not advocate for an androgynous world, a world where there is no gender. That we're not saying to do away with gender, but the question, the reason this is an issue is because the feminine ways, the ways of dress, of interaction, the more demure, I think that's the word. The child taking care of kids, the cooking, the arts and craft, all of those things get associated with feminine, is considered less than the competitive, the competitive, logical, ambitious ways associated with men. So the assignment or the activity that I've associated with this point in the chapter is one where you're invited to look at a list of human characteristics and identify 3, the 3 that you think of as a healthy adult female or male. I forget which one I have first. And then look at a list and identify the characteristics that you associate with a healthy adult female or male, whichever one you start with, and then compare your lists. And perhaps your lists are different, perhaps your lists are the same, but why did you decide on the characteristics that you assign? That's when we talk about the sociological significance of gender. The significance is this is the most fundamental way that we have divided humanity. Everything in our culture is divided by gender. Clothes, sports, even, guns are even divided. You have a boy gun and a girl gun. Food, so if we were together, I'd say, tell me a male food, or a TV show, or a movie, or music. All the cars, they're all divided by gender. It is the most fundamental social divider. And once we have put people into these groups, then we say, oh, you're a girl, you have to act this way, and you're a boy, and you have to act this way. This is what we refer to as gender norms. And you remember from chapter 2, gender norms make life predictable. So when you have been gendered, when you have been assigned feminine, female, you are expected to act a certain way. And when you don't act a certain way, you're violating that norm, you're creating unpredictability. So in that sense, gender norms are a kind of social control. The significance is they fundamentally separate us, and they act as social control. Once you are assigned a gender box, you're supposed to stay in that gender box. I'm going to argue at some later on in another lecture that violating that gender box is worse for boys than it is for girls.